Joe versus the volcano may look quirky and absurd on the surface, but through the lens of A Course in Miracles, it becomes a surprisingly profound story about awakening from deadened living, confronting fear, releasing false identity, and rediscovering aliveness. At the beginning, Joe lives in a gray, mechanical world that feels almost spiritually suffocating. His office is fluorescent, repetitive, lifeless. People move like sleepwalkers. That's very ACM. The Course often describes the ego's world as a kind of unconsciousness, a life organized around survival, routine, anxiety, obligation, and muted despair while pretending this is normal. Joe himself barely seems alive. He's not dramatically miserable. He's worse, numb. That distinction matters. The ego doesn't always appear as intense suffering. Sometimes it appears as chronic dullness, resignation, and quiet meaninglessness. Then Joe receives the diagnosis, a brain cloud, which is almost hilariously ACIM-like. Because ACIM essentially says humanity lives under a kind of perceptual cloud, confused thinking mistaken for identity. Joe's diagnosis becomes the shock that interrupts autopilot. The ego often changes only when its continuity gets disrupted. Mortality enters, control cracks, the routine stops feeling sustainable. Then suddenly Joe starts noticing life, light, objects, people, possibility. ACIM calls this the beginning of willingness, not enlightenment, just maybe there is another way to see. Then comes the bizarre invitation, jump into a volcano. From the ego's perspective, this is insane. But symbolically, the volcano becomes an image of surrender. ACM repeatedly points toward the undoing of the self-concept, the willingness to let the false identity die. Not physical death, but psychological release. Joe gradually stops clinging to the life that was never truly alive to begin with. That's why the movie shifts visually as he awakens. The world becomes more colorful, spacious, strange, meaningful. Reality itself appears transformed. ACM would say, perception changes when the teacher in the mind changes. The world reflects consciousness. There's also a deep ACM theme around specialness and value. Joe begins as someone who believes he is fundamentally insignificant. The world around him reinforces this constantly. He is treated as expendable machinery. The ego swings between inferiority and superiority, but both are forms of separation identity. Then Joe begins discovering simple dignity. Clothing he enjoys, conversation, wonder, care, risk, presence. Not because he becomes better, but because aliveness returns. The luggage scene is especially symbolic. Joe buys beautiful luggage despite believing he is going to die soon. Why? Because for the first time he chooses beauty and meaning rather than mere utility. ACIM often points toward appreciation and presence emerging naturally when fear loosens. Not attachment to possessions, but release from reductionism. Life becomes participatory again. Then there are the three women, all played by Meg Ryan. This is psychologically rich. The same face appears in different forms. The insecure coworker, the emotionally disconnected socialite, the deeply alive Patricia. ACIM might interpret this as projection and perception evolving. The ego first encounters relationship through limitation and need, but gradually Joe learns to actually see rather than merely project roles. Patricia especially represents openness to mystery and vulnerability rather than social performance. The relationship feels less like possession and more like shared awakening into immediacy. Then comes the ocean. The ocean in ACIM-like symbolism often represents the unknown beyond ego control. Joe literally leaves structured civilization and enters uncertainty. And then the raft scene happens. This is one of the most ACM moments in the entire film. Joe and Patricia are floating under the stars after losing everything. No plan, no certainty, no control, possibly near death. And strangely, peace appears. Why? Because the ego's frantic structures temporarily collapse. Joe says, "I have no interest in myself anymore." That line can sound depressive if misunderstood, but spiritually it points toward release from obsessive self-concern. The ego is constantly managing. How am I doing? What will happen to me? Am I safe? Am I important? For a moment, Joe drops psychological self-management and simply experiences existence directly. Wonder replaces control. ACIM often describes miracles similarly, the interruption of self-preoccupation. Then there's the volcano itself. Joe ultimately jumps willingly. Not because death is glorified, but because fear no longer fully governs him. The irony is important. Once he truly lets go psychologically, life opens. That's deeply aligned with ACIM's paradox. When the ego loosens its death grip on identity and control, what remains is not annihilation, but spaciousness. Still, the movie wisely stays playful rather than preachy. It understands something important. Awakening is not merely solemn transcendence. There's humor, absurdity, music, romance, strangeness, very unlike the ego's rigid seriousness. And perhaps the deepest ACIM resonance in the film is this. Joe's real illness was never the brain cloud. It was forgetting how to live before dying.